I supported my boyfriend through medical school, and he left me for another woman when he graduated. The day I met him, I had coffee grounds under my nails, a stain on my left sleeve, and exactly $12 in my checking account, which felt rude because I had just finished a double shift and was already trying to calculate whether I could stretch a bag of rice, some eggs, and an overdue electric bill into something that looked like a life. He was sitting at a back table in the coffee shop where I worked mornings, hunched over a stack of thick textbooks with that tired, serious face people get when they are trying so hard not to fall apart that they accidentally look arrogant. I almost disliked him on sight for that exact reason. Then he asked if I could refill his cup and apologized for taking up the table for hours, and I noticed his hands were shaking a little when he reached for his wallet. Not from attitude, from stress. He told me he had just started medical school at a state university nearby. First year, 4 years ahead of him if he could make it through, and was trying to figure out how to survive the part nobody romanticizes. Tuition was mostly handled through a mix of aid and loans, but housing, food, transportation, lab fees, all the ugly little daily costs that don't fit into those shiny acceptance photos, those were another story. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because that was the most normal thing I had heard all week. Everybody I knew was surviving one hidden fee at a time. I was working mornings at the coffee shop, afternoons at a discount store, and picking up office cleaning shifts whenever the crew needed extra hands after everybody richer than us had already gone home. He looked embarrassed when he admitted he was considering dropping out if he couldn't make the math work. I remember telling him, probably too bluntly, that it would be stupid to quit if this was the one big thing he had fought for. That was how it started. Not with fireworks, not with destiny, not with any of that movie nonsense. It started with two tired people talking near a pastry case while my manager pretended not to notice that I had been standing there too long. He came back the next day, then the day after that, and by the time he finally told me his name was Nolan, I was already setting aside the burnt end of a coffee cake for him because he liked the cinnamon edge pieces, and I liked the way he smiled when he forgot to be guarded. He told me about growing up broke, about always feeling like the smartest poor kid in the room and somehow the least comfortable one, about wanting a life that didn't depend on which bill could wait. I told him enough about myself to make it fair. My mother had been unstable in the exhausting, everyday way, not the dramatic one people make documentaries about. My sister had figured out early that being charming got her farther than being reliable. I left home young, bounced through roommates and bad leases, and one terrible boyfriend who thought borrowing money meant never returning it. And by the time I met Nolan, I had become the kind of woman who could spot a shutoff notice through an envelope before even opening it. We started dating because one night he walked me to the bus stop after my shift, and I was so tired I sat on the bench and almost cried over nothing. Literally nothing. A broken shoelace. He sat next to me and waited it out instead of trying to fix me, and that tiny act felt more intimate than half the grand gestures people brag about online. A few weeks later, he kissed me outside my apartment building, and from there it all moved fast in that dangerous way things do when hope gets involved. He spent more nights over. Then most nights. Then his room near campus felt pointless, expensive, and impossible. He showed me the numbers one evening on the back of a grocery receipt, and I showed him mine. And somewhere in the middle of a conversation about rent, bus passes, and whether boxed pasta counted as a personality trait, I made the decision that changed my life. I told him if he could keep his tuition covered and stay focused on school, I would handle the rest for a while. Not because I was rich. I could barely afford my own life. But because I believed in leverage, in timing, in two people dragging each other somewhere better. I said we could live small now and breathe later. I said when he finished medical school, matched somewhere decent, and started earning real money, we would finally get to be the couple that slept normal hours, bought groceries without panic, and maybe got married in a courthouse with cheap flowers and a dinner we actually enjoyed. He stared at me like I had handed him oxygen. He said, "You'd really do that for me?" And I said yes. Because back then, that answer felt romantic instead of catastrophic. He recorded a voice note that same night while I was washing dishes, half joking and half emotional, thanking me for believing in him, saying I was investing in our future, saying he would never forget it. I kept that message for years. I wish I could say I knew to save it on purpose. I didn't. I kept it because hearing someone sound that grateful was addictive. So we made our little arrangement. He would study like his life depended on it, because in a way it did. And I would keep the lights on, food in the cabinets, and the sort of fragile stability that lets another person dream big. I picked up extra overnight cleaning shifts almost immediately. I started sleeping in weird fragments and telling myself this pace was temporary, I told myself this was temporary. I told myself love sometimes looked like exhaustion before it looked like comfort. I told myself a lot of things then. Some of them were even true for a while. The first year ran on caffeine, bus schedules, and delusion, which sounds harsher than it felt at the time. At the time, I was weirdly happy. Miserable physically, sure, but emotionally, I was full of that scrappy, hungry kind of hope that makes cheap dinners feel like a team sport. I woke up before sunrise to make coffee and eggs if we had eggs, toast if we didn't. And on especially bad weeks, I pretended that buttered crackers counted as breakfast because I didn't want him starting a clinical lab on an empty stomach. Then I rushed to the coffee shop, went straight from there to the discount store, and after a quick change in the employee bathroom, headed to the office cleaning crew at night. I got very good at carrying deodorant, spare socks, and acting more functional than I felt. Nolan studied all the time, and honestly, that part was real. He wasn't faking the workload. He would come home with underlined pages, complicated terms, stories about anatomy labs, and that glassy-eyed look of somebody living inside a permanent test. In those early months, he still tried. That matters, even if it makes everything that came later more infuriating. He'd rub my shoulders while I heated soup from a can. He'd listen when I complained about my manager cutting hours for people she personally disliked, which was apparently most of the staff. He'd tell me little facts from class in a voice that made him sound like a kid showing off a science project. And I'd sit there in a thrift store sweatshirt, smelling like bleach and coffee, thinking, okay, this is hard, but it means something. We didn't go anywhere expensive because obviously we couldn't. So we built a whole private culture out of things that were free or close enough. We watched old movies on a hand-me-down television that took forever to turn on. We split one dessert from the grocery clearance rack every Friday if the week had not actively tried to kill me. We walked around the neighborhood at night when the apartment felt too hot and listened to other people's air conditioners rattle. Sometimes we talked about the future in embarrassing detail. He wanted a clean apartment with big windows and one room that could be an office. I wanted a couch no one had rescued from the curb and a kitchen where the drawers opened without swearing at them first. We talked about marriage the way tired people do, not like a fantasy wedding board, more like, one day we'll sign some papers, eat some cake, and stop being scared all the time. I started saying no to little things without even noticing. A coworker invited me out after work for drinks and I said I couldn't. My sister called asking to borrow money and I laughed so hard she got offended. My mother left me a voicemail about how family helps family, which was rich coming from a woman who had once sold my old desk while I was still living there because she needed cash flow. I deleted it while waiting for the bus. Nolan would tell me I was incredible, that no one had ever believed in him like this, that when he made it, I was going to rest. That was the word he used. Rest. As if he knew exactly how to hit the softest part of me, as if he knew I had been tired since childhood. By the middle of that year, I was taking the occasional weekend catering shift too. Mostly weddings and office events where people in clean clothes asked for extra sauce without looking directly at the person serving them. I'd come home with little packets of sugar stolen from coffee stations because free sugar was free sugar, and Nolan would pull me into bed and tell me we were building something. I believed him so hard it almost makes me embarrassed now. Almost. But I also think people are too smug about what they would never fall for. If nobody has ever loved you in exactly the place you were starving, you don't actually know. The apartment was tiny and always either too cold or too warm, but it felt like ours. We had our routines. His books spreading across the table. My uniforms hanging over chairs to dry because the laundry room charged too much and the dryers barely worked. The jar on the counter where I dropped loose change and emergency cash. The list on the fridge with due dates written in marker. We kissed in the kitchen. We fought over nothing and made up fast. He said once, very quietly, that he couldn't wait until I didn't have to live like this anymore, and I kissed him before he could see my face because I actually got emotional over it. Which, yes, sounds pathetic now. I know. What I didn't understand then was that he loved the setup a lot more than he loved the cost of it. Still, that first year felt like proof that hard things were survivable if two people meant what they said. I went into the second year committed and still buying the dream harder than I should have. The second year was when money stopped being background stress and became a living thing in the apartment, like mold you couldn't fully scrub out. Fees started popping up everywhere. Lab fees, exam fees, supplies, required equipment, a textbook that cost more than my monthly groceries and apparently could not be bought used because this particular professor changed editions like it was a personality trait. Nolan would come home tense, trying not to sound panicked, and say things like, "I hate to ask, but this one is actually necessary." And I would feel my stomach drop before I even saw the number. I took out my first personal loan on a lunch break, sitting in a cramped office with fluorescent lights, and a man who kept tapping his keyboard like my financial humiliation was taking too long. The interest rate was disgusting. I signed anyway. What was I going to do? Let him drop a required class over a fee I might somehow survive? That is how these traps work. Nobody drags you into them dramatically. You walk in because you love somebody, because there are bills due, because the alternative feels worse. Then you come out with a payment plan strapped to your back and tell yourself it's temporary. My own life got smaller and smaller in ways I barely registered in real time. I stopped buying lunch and skipped meals often enough that my body adjusted. I lied to Nolan a lot about basic things. I said I had already eaten. I said a bill had been lower than expected. I said a coworker had given me a ride when really I walked because I needed bus fare elsewhere. He noticed some of it, but not most of it. And the part of me that wanted him to notice kept arguing with the part of me that was proud of shielding him. Then there was the stupid, expensive stethoscope. I still remember that, because it was one of the first times I felt something sour under my sympathy. He mentioned that a lot of students had better equipment, that certain professors were weird about presentation, that he felt out of place. He didn't directly ask. He just said it in that disappointed voice. And I spent the next 2 days thinking about it while scanning discount shirts and smiling at customers who talked to me like I was furniture. Finally, I sold the last nice thing I owned from my grandmother, a thin gold bracelet she had left me when she died. It wasn't valuable enough to change my life, but it covered the equipment. I handed him the box that evening, and he lit up like a child. He kissed me, told me I was unbelievable, and then spent the next hour taking pictures of it from different angles. I went to the bathroom and cried quietly, not because I regretted it exactly, but because I had just traded family history for an object he would use around people who would never know what it cost me. A few months into his second year, the debt collectors started calling more aggressively. They always somehow knew the worst possible time. During my break, while I was stocking shelves, while I was standing outside in the cold waiting to clock into the cleaning shift, I got good at whispering, "Can I make a partial payment Friday?" while pretending I was just checking a voicemail. One woman spoke to me in the fake sympathetic tone people use when they are about to threaten you politely. I went into the supply closet after that call and sat on an upside-down bucket for 5 minutes staring at mop handles like they were going to offer life advice. They didn't, for the record. Emotionally, Nolan started pulling away in tiny, deniable ways. Not enough to confront, not enough to make a neat list, just enough to make me feel lonelier in my own apartment. He was always tired, always buried, always distracted. When he did talk, it was about school. When I talked, he listened with half his face turned toward a screen or a textbook or the next thing. Sometimes I'd say something and know by the beat of silence that he had not heard a word. Then he'd apologize, kiss my forehead, tell me he was fried, and I would swallow my hurt because, technically, he wasn't wrong. He was fried. So was I. But only one of us still had energy for the other. I worked sick more times than I can count that year. Fever, cough, stomach bug, weird rash from cleaning products didn't matter. Missing one shift could mean late rent, and late rent could mean a fee, and a fee could mean dominoes falling for weeks. I started living in that permanent, almost panic that poor people know too well, where even a small inconvenience has to be treated like an incoming storm. Through all of it, I kept hearing his old promises in my head. When I make it, when this pays off, when you can finally breathe. I held on to those words so hard they left marks, even after he had already started becoming someone else. By the third year, Nolan had started orbiting a different world. And I don't mean that in a dramatic way. I mean literally a different set of rooms, people, expectations, and social rules. There were more dinners with classmates, more study groups that somehow happened at expensive restaurants, more little networking events tied to internships, faculty mixers, donor things, hospital-adjacent events where everybody wore neutral colors and spoke in calm, polished voices. He started talking about professional environments the way people talk after they have spent enough time around money to mistake comfort for character. At first, I tried to be supportive. Of course I did. I ironed his shirts as best I could. I learned the names of departments I didn't understand. I asked how the event went, who he met, whether it felt promising. He would answer, but vaguely, like the details weren't for me. One night I joked that maybe I should come to one of these mysterious gatherings, since I was apparently dating a future doctor and all. He laughed, but there was this strange tightness in it. And he said it would probably be boring for me, just people talking shop. Boring for me. I let that one slide and then got angry at myself later in the shower because it sat under my skin all night. He started noticing things about me that had never been problems before. My accent, my clothes, the way I spoke too directly. He'd make polishing comments. Maybe say it this way. Maybe don't joke like that around them. Maybe wear the blue one if we go somewhere. I knew the difference between help and editing. The first time I showed up near campus unexpectedly, it was because I had a break between jobs and wanted to surprise him with lunch. Cheap lunch, obviously, but still. I had packed sandwiches, fruit, and one of those generic sparkling waters he liked. He was standing outside one of the buildings with a group from school, all of them in nice coats, laughing about something. When he saw me, his face did this quick flicker. Not joy. Not even confusion. Annoyance. Tiny, but real. He recovered fast and came over, but the damage was done. He took the bag, thanked me in that stiff public voice, and barely introduced me. "This is Marisol," he said, as if I were a neighbor borrowing sugar instead of the woman holding his whole life together with overtime and Tylenol. I stood there feeling too visible and somehow invisible at the same time, which is a disgusting combo if you've never had the pleasure. Later, he said I was being unfair, that he had just been caught off guard, that I made things awkward because people were in the middle of a conversation. Maybe. But that day, something snapped into focus. I began noticing how often he acted one way with me in private and another way around the people whose approval he wanted. It wasn't just stress anymore. It was curation. He was rearranging his life so I fit into it only when it was convenient and looked invisible when it wasn't. The receipts started too. Fancy restaurants, valet charges, cocktails I could not pronounce if you paid me. He always had explanations. A classmate's birthday, somebody else's treat, group celebrations after exams. I told myself not to be paranoid because jealousy can make you stupid, and I was trying so hard not to be that woman, the suspicious one, the clingy one, the girlfriend who resents ambition because she doesn't understand the world it requires. I kept editing myself right alongside him. That was probably the most humiliating part. I didn't just let him move me into the shadows. I helped dim the lights. By the time he was heading into his final year, I was desperate for something concrete to hold on to, and I don't just mean money. I mean language, dates, plans, proof that the life we had bled for together was still ours and not just some training ground he planned to graduate out of. I brought up marriage one Sunday afternoon while folding laundry on the bed, which in hindsight was maybe too domestic a setting for a conversation that ended with my whole chest cracking open, but whatever. I wasn't asking for a ring that second. I wasn't dragging him toward a florist. I just said maybe we should start talking seriously about next steps, about what the timeline looked like once he graduated and had a real salary coming in. Totally reasonable. Disturbingly reasonable, actually. He went stiff. "I don't have room for this right now. You always pick the worst times." "The worst times?" I repeated. "When would be a good time exactly? When I'm not under pressure about matching with the right hospital and not ruining my future." "You're making everything about us." "About us?" I was holding one of his socks. "This was never framed as just your future. You called it ours. You promised me." He sighed in that exhausted, superior way that makes you want to swing a lamp. "Maybe you're too focused on promises made when we were younger and broke. Maybe you should be more realistic about how people's priorities change." Realistic. That word again. Like realism meant me shutting up while he revised history in real time. The fight got uglier from there because I stopped trying to be graceful. I brought up the jobs, the rent, the loans, the groceries, the fact that I had spent years keeping him alive on cheap food and bad sleep. He said, "I never asked you to do all that," which is one of those sentences that should come with a warning label because it can change how you hear every memory that came before it. I literally laughed when he said it. Not because it was funny, but because my body refused to process that level of cruelty soberly. I asked if he wanted to go back and edit the voice notes too, maybe re-record the gratitude in a calmer tone. He told me I was being dramatic. Then, and this is the part I still replay sometimes when I want to ruin my own day, he said maybe if I had spent these years building something for myself instead of hovering around his career, I wouldn't feel so insecure now, hovering around his career. I wish I could report that I stood up, delivered a devastating speech, and kicked him out on the spot. I didn't. I cried. Quietly at first, then not quietly. I hate admitting that because people love dignity in hindsight. But the truth is, I cried the way people cry when they realize they have been speaking one language in a relationship, while the other person has already moved on to another and forgot to mention it. He stood there irritated. Not comforting. Not cruel in an explosive way, just cold. That was new. Cold Nolan was worse than angry Nolan because anger at least implied emotion. Cold Nolan looked at me like I was a problem to manage. After that conversation, something changed in the apartment that never fully changed back. He stayed later at school. He took calls in other rooms. He stopped making even fake future comments. The tenderness dried up so thoroughly it became embarrassing to remember it had ever been there. When I was too tired to cook something decent, he made little remarks about how we couldn't keep eating like college freshmen forever. When I pointed out that college freshmen usually weren't juggling 2 jobs, extra shifts, and a grown man's dreams on their spine, he accused me of weaponizing sacrifice. That was another favorite move of his by then. Turn my labor into manipulation the second I expected it to mean anything. Meanwhile, I was still drowning. The rent was due. The loan payments were due. My body felt older than it was. My mother called one day asking if I could help my sister with a deposit because she was between jobs again, and I actually started laughing so hard I had to sit down on the floor. The kind of laugh that sounds 1 inch away from a breakdown. Family apparently only counts when they want something. That part never changes. Somewhere in that final year, I started seeing the real shape of what had happened to me. I had not simply supported a partner through a hard season. I had constructed an entire platform out of my own life and invited him to stand on it until he could reach a world where he no longer had use for me. And because I loved him, because I am not proud enough to pretend I didn't, I stayed in that apartment trying to salvage the version of him that had once looked me in the eye and said we were building something together. He was already gone. I just hadn't caught up yet. When he graduated from medical school and matched into a residency program at a respected hospital, I still threw him a celebration. That sentence alone should qualify me for some kind of support group. I used the last bit of free cash I had after rent to buy cheap decorations, a grocery store cake, and those little plastic trays that make food look more intentional than it is. I cleaned the apartment top to bottom, even though I had worked the night before and my knees were throbbing. I told myself maybe this would reset things. Maybe once the pressure of school was off, he would come back to himself. Maybe he would look around, see what I had done, and feel ashamed of how distant he had become. Hope can make a woman decorate her own humiliation in streamers. A few of his co-workers and former classmates came by, plus 2 people from my jobs who actually liked me enough to show up with paper plates and genuine excitement. The apartment looked exactly like what it was. A cramped place paid for by a woman who had been surviving, not posing. Nolan walked in, took one look around, and I saw it hit his face before he could hide it. Embarrassment. He thanked me, but there was a stiffness to it, like he was trying not to react too strongly in front of witnesses. For the rest of the evening, he floated. He never settled beside me. He never once put an arm around me and said, "This is the woman who got me here." He introduced me to one coworker as Marisol. "We've known each other forever," which was technically true in the same way calling a house fire a temperature issue is technically true. One of my friends from the discount store hugged me and whispered, "Girl, are you okay?" while pretending to admire the cake. That was how obvious it was. The whole night he seemed preoccupied with managing impressions. His coworkers were dressed nicely without looking like they had tried, which is a class signal all by itself. They asked the sort of soft questions people ask when they don't know what to do with a setting beneath their expectations. Where was he thinking of living now that he was starting at the hospital? Was he staying near this area much longer? Had he considered closer options? He answered them like I wasn't standing 3 feet away. I felt like unpaid staff at my own event. At one point, I came out of the kitchen and heard one of them joke that residency pay would at least get him out of starter housing, and Nolan laughed. Not politely, not nervously. He laughed like he agreed. After that night, he started spending money on himself in a way that made me feel actually dizzy. Better clothes, more expensive shoes, a watch that, according to him, mattered for professional image, though I failed to see how telling time in a hospital requires swallowing my grocery budget whole. He replaced his old phone even though the old one worked fine. He got haircuts more often. He started buying cologne that clung to our bathroom like ambition and bad choices. Every purchase came with a justification. He had to look the part. People notice these things. First impressions matter. Meanwhile, debt collectors were still calling me, not him, because all the ugly paperwork lived under my name. One afternoon, I told him a creditor was threatening legal action if I didn't make a larger payment that month. He barely looked up from the message on his screen and said he couldn't keep bailing out every mess from the past when he needed to establish himself. I stared at him so long he finally looked uncomfortable. "Every mess from the past?" I repeated, because I wanted to make sure the cruelty had arrived in its final form and I wasn't mishearing it. He rubbed his forehead and said he didn't mean it like that, which is what people say when they absolutely meant it like that, but hate the echo of their own voice. He started staying out later after shifts too. At first it was easy to believe because hospitals are brutal and schedules are chaos. He said there were team dinners, drinks after long days, social obligations that helped him fit in. I wanted to be supportive, and also I was so tired I could barely think. So I swallowed my suspicions and kept doing what I had always done. Working, paying, adjusting, hoping, shrinking. Sometimes he came home after midnight smelling like expensive soap and bar air. Sometimes he barely came near me before showering. We were still sleeping in the same bed, technically. But the relationship had started to feel like one of those leases where one person has mentally moved out months before the boxes appear. The worst part was how embarrassed I became by my own need. I wanted acknowledgement so badly it made me feel small. I wanted him to say out loud, to anybody, to me, to a wall, that I mattered in the story of his success. I wanted him to look at the bills on the counter and say, "I've got this now. Rest." Remember that? His word. Instead, he drifted further into this polished version of himself while I kept dragging around the wreckage of the version that had helped build him. There is a specific kind of loneliness in realizing someone still accepts your labor while already rejecting your place in their future. I lived in that loneliness for weeks before I saw the first hard proof that I had not been paranoid enough. I saw them at a hotel ballroom because life apparently enjoys slapstick when it comes to heartbreak. I had picked up an extra catering shift for a corporate event, one of those glossy networking evenings where everybody has name tags, tiny plates, and opinions about wine they did not grow themselves. I was wearing a black server uniform, with shoes that pinched and one of those fake neutral smiles you learn in service work. And I was already in a bad mood because my manager had changed the setup twice, and someone in a suit had clicked his fingers at me like summoning a pet. Then I looked toward the entrance, and there was Nolan. He wasn't alone. The woman beside him looked exactly like the kind of life he had started trying on. Not because she was prettier than me in any objective fairy tale way. I am too old for that nonsense. But she looked expensive in the relaxed, inherited sense. Her dress fit like it had been chosen for her, not hunted down under fluorescent lights after a markdown. Her hair looked effortless in the way effortful things do when money is involved. She was laughing at something he said, and he was leaning toward her with this open, attentive warmth I had not seen aimed at me in so long that my body recognized it before my mind did. Then he touched the small of her back. Then, a little later, when they thought nobody was paying attention, he kissed her. I didn't drop a tray or burst into tears or make a scene. I just froze for one horrible second and then kept moving because when you work jobs like that, your body learns to obey before your heart catches up. I carried drinks to a table while my ears rang. I smiled at strangers. I stood near a service station pretending to fold napkins, while secretly watching the man I had supported for years court another woman like he had never once come home to me smelling like bleach and fatigue. He looked lighter with her. That was what made me want to scream. Lighter. As if I had been the weight and not the reason he was standing in that room at all. I took one picture. Just one. My hand was shaking so badly I was shocked it came out clear. Them near the bar, his face turned toward hers, his hand still on her back. Then I put my phone away because I genuinely thought I might throw up. I finished the shift somehow. I don't remember most of it. I remember someone asking for more ice. I remember the smell of roasted chicken making me nauseous. I remember locking myself in a restroom stall for maybe 3 minutes and staring at my own shoes like they belonged to a different woman, one who had made better choices and therefore was not currently on the clock at the venue where her boyfriend was introducing his new life to donors and colleagues. He came home near dawn. I was sitting on the couch in the dark, with all the lights off because I didn't trust myself to do anything dramatic if I stayed in the bedroom. He smelled like cologne and someone else's perfume and that late-night sweetness hotels always have, like money and stale air conditioning. He said he had been stuck at an extended work thing. I just looked at him. He kept talking. A long shift, then drinks, then networking, then one of the attendings wanted to introduce him around. Lie after lie, laid down casually, like he thought the years had trained me to accept whatever shape of reality he offered. I didn't confront him that second because I was too stunned and, if I'm honest, too strategic. That surprised me about myself. Usually when I am hurt, I go hot. I say the thing. I make the call. I send the text and regret it 12 minutes later, but that night I just nodded once and said I was tired. He showered and crawled into bed. I stayed on the couch until the sun started lifting, and then I got up, made coffee with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, and started noticing every lie that had been sitting in plain sight. The next few days I investigated quietly. I checked what I could check. I watched how he moved. I asked one careful question here and another there. It didn't take long to learn that the woman was the daughter of some local businessman with enough money and connections to make Nolan's eyes light up from across a room. She had never really had to work, from what I gathered. She floated in and out of charity boards, event planning committees, hospital fundraisers, that whole polished world of soft power and clean nails. She was not just a side relationship, she was a bridge. That realization hurt more than the cheating by itself. If he had simply slept with someone out of selfishness, that would have been ugly but ordinary. This was something else. This was an upgrade strategy with flirting attached. He wasn't just betraying me physically. He was reorganizing his entire identity around a more useful woman, one whose presence made his new life easier to explain and more impressive to inhabit. I started understanding, with this cold little clarity that made me feel sick, that I had become the secret embarrassing origin story. The rough draft. The person you don't mention when you are trying to sell everyone a cleaner version of yourself. When I finally confronted him, I showed him the photo first. No preamble, no dramatic speech, just the image on my phone between us at the kitchen table. His face changed, then hardened. Not guilt. Anger. "Did you follow me?" he said immediately. "Jesus, Marisol, taking pictures of me? That's invasive, that's unhinged." I laughed. That awful laugh I'd started doing around him. "I was working. You were cheating." Different verbs. "This isn't what it looks like. Don't." I cut him off. "You kissed her. Your hand was on her back. Try again." He pushed back from the table so fast the chair scraped. "Maybe we need to rethink everything if this is who you're becoming." "Who I'm becoming," I repeated slowly. "The person who caught you. That's who I'm becoming. Who I was becoming." As if betrayal had happened to him. After that confrontation, he grabbed some clothes and left, staying with a classmate for 2 nights. He sent one message saying he needed space because things had gotten toxic, which almost impressed me with its audacity. Toxic. Right. I went to work, came home, stared at the apartment, and felt rage moving through me in these weird waves. Not clean or empowering, just exhausting. I wanted to smash things. I wanted to beg. I wanted to call his supervisor and my mother and the moon. Instead, I made a list of everything in the apartment that technically belonged to me, which was almost all of it. That calmed me down more than breathing exercises ever have. On the 3rd day, while he was still gone, I opened our shared laptop at home because I needed an old receipt for rent, and his messages were right there because apparently the brilliant future doctor had not logged out properly. I know some people will act horrified about privacy at this point, but spare me. Privacy is not sacred after you use it to build a second life on my dime. I clicked. Of course I clicked. What I found somehow still managed to be worse than the hotel. The relationship with that woman had been going on for months. Not casual months either. Full story-building months. There were pet names. There were plans. There were messages from him saying he finally felt understood, which, wow, thank you. That one had range. There were long little essays about his ambitions, his frustrations, his belief that he had outgrown old circumstances. She asked almost nothing practical and reacted to all his nonsense like he was delivering prophecy. He loved that. Men always love that. And threaded through those messages was a version of me so distorted I had to read some lines twice. In his telling, I was basically a fated obligation. A woman from an old chapter. He implied we were barely together in any real sense. In one message, he wrote that I had become impossible to talk to because I resented his success. In another, he said our relationship had been dying for a long time, which was interesting considering he had still been eating food I paid for and sleeping in my bed every night. The most disgusting parts were the messages to friends. He described her as the kind of partner who matched the life he was stepping into. He said she fit. He said I looked exhausted all the time and brought the energy of struggle into every room. Brought the energy of struggle. I sat there in our apartment, with the cracked dish rack and the overdue power notice and the cheap curtains I had hemmed by hand, and thought, yes, Nolan, that struggle would be the one that put you through medical school. There were receipts, too. Gifts, dinners, rides, little expensive gestures, all bought with the salary he had refused to use to help me catch up on the debts created while supporting him. That was the moment something in me finally cooled. Not healed, not strengthened, cooled. Enough to become practical. I printed screenshots at a copy place on my break the next morning, paid in coins and felt deranged doing it, but also weirdly steady. There is power in paper. A digital lie can still try to wiggle. A printed one just sits there and stares back. When he returned that evening, I had his bags packed by the door. Not everything, because some of it I needed help identifying, but enough to make the point. He took one look and said, "What is this?" in the calm tone people use right before they become the victim in their own memoir. I told him it was his move-out process. He said he lived there. I said no, actually, I lived there, paid there, signed there, and apparently funded his ability to cheat from there. He tried to pivot into conversation mode, asking if we could not do this in such an extreme way. I handed him a folder of screenshots. He went pale then, which was the first truly satisfying facial expression I had seen from him in months. We fought for over an hour. He accused me of violating his privacy, manipulating the narrative, clinging to promises from when we were young and saying reckless things. I accused him of using me, lying to me, and then trying to erase me once my usefulness no longer matched his ambitions. He actually said I was acting like I deserved ownership over his entire future because I helped him when times were hard. Helped him. Again with that minimizing language, like I had loaned him a jacket instead of underwriting his life. At one point, I asked him to say the sentence out loud. You carried us for years, and I repaid you by cheating and pretending you were embarrassing. He refused because once you phrase things honestly, they stop sounding defensible. Then he said the cruelest thing he had ever said to me. He told me I had wasted my best years betting on a man who never loved me the way I loved him. Not in anger exactly. In clarity. As if he thought I needed the truth. I remember gripping the edge of the counter so hard my nails hurt. I also remember noticing, absurdly, that one of the overhead bulbs was flickering and thinking I had meant to replace it weeks earlier. Your brain is weird in crisis. It reaches for errands because reality is too ugly. I told him to get out. Properly this time. Not theatrically. Not go cool off. Get out. He threatened to fight me on it until I reminded him the lease was in my name, the utilities were in my name, and if he wanted this to become public among his carefully curated colleagues, I was available to discuss details. That landed. He was already halfway into his new life, and scandal was inconvenient. He shoved some clothes into the bags, muttered that I was impossible, and left with the kind of righteousness only cheaters seem able to access on demand. The apartment was silent after. Just devastatingly silent. I sat on the floor and cried so hard my ribs hurt. Then I made tea because I didn't know what else to do. Which felt insane, but tea is what people make when things are bad enough to be stupid. I kept looking around at all the years still sitting in the room, the chipped mugs, the bookshelves, the dent in the couch cushion where he used to fall asleep studying back when he still let me matter. He had gone, but the debt had not. The grief had not. The bills definitely had not. I was alone with the invoice of loving him. The next morning, I went to a free legal clinic at a community center 2 bus rides away because panic had finally evolved into logistics. I had barely slept. My face was puffy, my stomach was wrecked, and I was carrying a folder that made a soft paper sound every time I moved, which somehow felt more dignified than the emotional disaster happening inside me. The volunteer lawyer was a woman with tired eyes and a cardigan that looked like it had seen some things. I trusted her immediately. Maybe because she didn't give me that pity smile people use when they assume you were just naive and should have known better. She just asked questions. Who was on the lease? Who paid which bills? Was there written proof of financial promises? Had he lived there continuously? Did I feel physically unsafe? Practical questions. Bless practical questions. I told her everything, including the humiliating parts. The jobs, the loans, the groceries. The years of covering rent and utilities and transportation while he studied. The voice notes, the texts, the cheating, the way he was now trying to recast all of it as me, making independent choices he had never requested. She listened, took notes, and said something that steadied me more than I expected. She said, "People like him always rely on informality. They think if love touched it, the record disappears." She explained that proving financial obligation between unmarried partners was complicated. In our state, there was no common law marriage, so I couldn't claim spousal rights. But there might be a case for unjust enrichment if I could show a clear pattern. Explicit promises of repayment, documented reliance on those promises, and evidence that he knew I was going into debt specifically to support him while he advanced his career. She warned me it wasn't guaranteed, that judges could see it as voluntary gifts between partners, but said the messages and receipts were strong enough to try. More importantly, she said, even filing would create public record and pressure, which sometimes mattered more than the legal outcome itself. I almost cried right there in the office because yes, exactly. Informality had been his shield. Our whole relationship had lived in that soft space between romance and unpaid labor, where everything feels too intimate to document until the day you need proof that you weren't hallucinating the exchange. Legally, the situation was not magical. She was very clear about that. This was not some movie where I could dramatically reclaim every dollar and watch a judge deliver a speech about justice while he shriveled in shame. But the lease was mine. So removing him was straightforward as long as I handled notice properly. As for the money, she said there might be a path if I could show a pattern of reliance, explicit promises, and documented contributions tied directly to the mutual expectation he had encouraged. Not guaranteed. Not pretty, but possible enough to pursue. Possible was all I had. So I started gathering everything. Every rent payment, utility bill, grocery receipt, bus pass refill, transfer, book purchase, equipment cost, lab fee, emergency payment. I dug through email folders and old messages like an archaeologist of my own bad decisions. I even found that voice note from the first night. His voice grateful and young, promising he would take care of me once he made it. I sent it to my lawyer with shaking hands. The more I collected, the sicker I felt. It wasn't even just the total, though the total was horrifying. It was the shape of my life emerging on paper. Year after year of me working, paying, compensating, adjusting, while his future got cleaner and shinier and mine got thinner around the edges. I found old messages from him thanking me, saying he couldn't have done this without me, saying once he was earning, he would take care of me the way I had taken care of him. There were enough of those to make his later denials look not just false, but insulting. A few weeks later, I also made one of the messier choices of my life, maybe the messiest after dating him in the first place. I wrote about what happened on a local community page using a throwaway account. I did not name him. I did not post his photo. I did not mention the hospital directly. I was not trying to get sued into a cardboard box. But I wrote the story in detail, enough detail that anyone who knew the situation well could probably connect the dots. I wrote about supporting a partner through medical school, working myself ragged, being promised a future, then getting discarded for someone wealthier once the degree and status were secured. I included blurred receipts and cropped screenshots to show I wasn't inventing the whole thing after one dramatic fight. Then I posted it and immediately felt like I might throw up. I expected maybe a few comments and then internet dust. Instead, it spread. Not viral in the national television sense, nothing ridiculous, but local enough and fast enough to become its own weather. Women shared their stories. Men shared stories about sisters or mothers who had carried someone the same way. Strangers argued about whether emotional labor counts when there are no contracts. Some people blamed me for being foolish, which, fine, that was always coming. But enough people recognized the pattern that the post gained traction beyond the usual little gossip circle. People are less shocked by cheating than by a recognizable scam dressed as romance. I watched the comments late at night with a mix of vindication and shame. Vindication because I was finally being believed in a way that did not require me to beg. Shame because even anonymous exposure still left me feeling bare. My sister messaged me after somebody sent her screenshots and asked, "Please tell me this isn't about you," which was such a perfectly self-centered family response that I laughed in the grocery line and startled the cashier. My mother called to say I was airing private matters publicly and ruining my own reputation. My own reputation. I asked her if she remembered the part where I had been financially gutted and cheated on. She said that was exactly why I should be keeping my head down, because people judge women harder. There it was. The family motto dressed as advice, absorb quietly. Then the other woman found out. Not from me directly. From someone in her circle who recognized enough of the story to ask questions. That part moved fast. Nolan had apparently told her a very polished version of his life. Self-made. Overcame hardship alone. Old relationship lingering in vague, unresolved sadness, but basically over. No mention of the woman carrying rent while he studied. No mention of years of support, promises, dependence, or the fact that he had crawled out of one life using someone else's spine and then tried to call it individual excellence. According to a mutual whisper chain that eventually reached me, she confronted him and things went badly. Her family did too. Turns out wealthy people do not love discovering that a carefully packaged professional man has been lying in ways that could become embarrassing at charity events. That didn't heal me, just to be clear. Other people's disappointment is not a bandage. But hearing that his little social ascension had hit turbulence because the backstory leaked out, that gave me enough energy to keep going. I wasn't just crying in the apartment anymore. I was organizing, filing, printing, building my own version of a record before he could finish erasing me from the public one. The case itself was not glamorous. I want to say that because people get weirdly addicted to courtroom fantasies when they hear words like lawsuit or hearing. Real legal processes, especially for regular people, are mostly fluorescent rooms, paperwork, rescheduling, stress nausea, and learning that justice is often just whoever has the patience to keep documenting. Nolan hired a lawyer faster than I expected, which told me two things right away. 1, he was scared. 2, he had resources available for defense that somehow had never existed when I needed help paying the debts from his school years. Love that for me. His side tried the obvious angle first. Everything I had done was voluntary. There had been no enforceable contract. Relationships involve support all the time. Adults make choices. Nobody forced me to work extra jobs and shifts. All technically plausible sentences if you stripped out context. History and the pile of messages where he repeatedly described the arrangement as something he would repay once he was able. That was the thing about Nolan. He had always counted on vibes. He counted on gratitude being too intimate to preserve, on sacrifice being too emotional to quantify, on my shame being stronger than my memory. Unfortunately for him, I had become both ashamed and organized, which is a dangerous combination in a woman with access to a copy machine. At one hearing, his attorney tried to frame me as a bitter ex weaponizing old communications after a breakup. I felt myself getting hot in the face, that familiar panic rage cocktail. Then my lawyer calmly introduced printed messages, years apart, where Nolan explicitly referred to my financial support as an investment in our future and promised to make it right once he started earning. She presented records showing his address, my lease, my payments, the recurring pattern of me covering his living costs while he advanced. She did not need a dramatic speech. She just stacked evidence. Watching that happen was weirdly intimate, like seeing someone translate my exhaustion into a language institutions actually respected. The pressure on him grew from more than one side, too. The engagement, from what I heard, quietly dissolved. Not with some huge public scandal, just a sudden cooling, postponed announcements, then nothing. He looked worse at the hearings than he had ever looked in our apartment, which I know is petty to enjoy. But I did enjoy it. Sue me. Actually, don't. He had the drawn, irritable face of someone learning that reinvention works best when nobody from the first draft keeps receipts. Some colleagues apparently knew pieces of the story by then. Not enough to destroy his career or anything extreme, but enough that the glossy narrative around him got scratches. That mattered to him more than I think the money ever did. Eventually, after 2 preliminary hearings where my evidence kept stacking up and his polished story kept getting harder to defend, his lawyer reached out privately. The legal case itself was shaky. We both knew that. But the exposure was killing him professionally. Colleagues were asking questions. The hospital where he worked had seen screenshots from my community post. His new social circle was watching. His lawyer floated a settlement. Partial reimbursement in exchange for signing an NDA and taking down any public posts. Not because I would definitely win in court, but because the cost of fighting publicly was higher than the money. Not every dollar. Not enough to restore the years. Not enough to buy back my health or my 20s or the bracelet from my grandmother, but enough to matter. Enough to clear the ugliest debts and stop the collector calls. I took the deal after arguing with myself for 3 nights. Part of me wanted to keep fighting out of principle. Another part of me knew principle doesn't keep the lights on. Survival won. Survival often has to. About 6 weeks after the settlement was signed, the first payment hit my account on a Thursday, while I was on break behind the discount store, sitting on an upside-down milk crate next to a delivery door that never closed right. I checked the balance 3 times because I didn't trust my eyes. Then I cried into a paper napkin and had to go back inside pretending seasonal candles were still the most important thing in my emotional life. I used that payment exactly how glamorous dreams are made of. I caught up on rent, paid down the worst loan, and bought groceries without doing calculator math in the aisle for the first time in months. I also bought myself decent insoles because my feet had been begging for mercy for years, and apparently I had decided martyrdom was a personality. Money did not fix the emotional part. It fixed the emergency part, which is not the same thing but is still holy in its own way. When survival panic quiets down even a little, the grief gets louder. I started sleeping badly, then sleeping too much on days off, then getting weirdly angry at commercials, songs, random men in hospital scrubs, women with engagement rings, cheap cinnamon coffee, all of it. I felt humiliated all over again every time someone said, "At least you got something back," because yes, technically true, but what a bleak consolation prize. Congratulations on recovering a fraction of the expenses from the man who used your devotion as scaffolding. Still, things changed. I was able to drop one job. Just one at first, but even that felt unreal. I stopped cleaning offices at night, which made me cry the last time I turned in my supply key. Not because I loved the work, obviously, but because my body had adapted so completely to constant depletion that the idea of ending one layer of it felt suspicious. I didn't know who I was after years of measuring my worth by how much I could carry. Exhaustion had been my identity for so long that rest felt like stolen property. Nolan had promised it to me once as a future reward. In the end, I had to claw back a shabby version of it through legal paperwork and spite. I also started noticing how deep the damage went beyond him. The whole setup with Nolan had hooked itself into older wounds I had never fully named. My mother loving whoever was easiest. My sister floating through life on charm while I became the responsible one by default. The family habit of treating my labor as atmosphere. Always there, never special, definitely not something requiring repayment. Nolan did not invent my weakness. He recognized it. He stepped into a role that my childhood had practically rehearsed for him. Once I saw that, I felt both wiser and more furious. Being used by one person is awful. Realizing half your emotional reflexes were trained to make you easy to use is worse. The community center offered a support group for women dealing with financial abuse and coercive relationships, and I joined even though I almost bailed the first night. I thought maybe I didn't belong because Nolan had never hit me, never screamed in the walls shaking way, never controlled what I wore or who I saw in the cartoon villain version people recognize instantly. But once the women started talking, I heard the pattern everywhere. The minimization, the promises, the dependence disguised as teamwork, the way your labor becomes invisible the moment you ask it to count. I sat there clutching a cup of bad coffee, listening to strangers tell pieces of my own life back to me in different accents, and felt something in me unclench. Not heal, just unclench enough to breathe. That was the season of my life when I became less romantic about endurance. I had always treated staying as proof of character, working harder as proof of love, understanding more as proof of maturity. What a scam. Sometimes staying is just staying. I had built a whole identity around enduring things that should have sent me running. These were not elegant insights. They arrived mean and practical, the way real lessons usually do. I stopped answering my mother's calls for a while, then eventually answered just to tell her I was done being the responsible one by default. My sister sent me a long message months later asking to reconnect, and I left it on read. Not forever, maybe, but for now. About 3 years after everything fell apart, I finished a part-time certificate program in office administration and got hired at a community hospital in a scheduling job with fixed hours and benefits. I moved into a smaller apartment with better light and drawers that actually opened, which felt nice. A while after that, a man from another department asked me to get coffee one afternoon, and I made him split the bill. He laughed. We took things slow. I did not need rescue. I needed consistency. The last payment from Nolan came through with no message. Good. By then, I didn't want an apology. I wanted my life to stop sounding like his biography. What I got was quieter and better. I got my name back. I got to stop confusing love with disappearing. I got to sit in my kitchen after work, eat dinner I could taste, and understand that peace is not dramatic, but it is honest. And after everything, honest was enough.